And now back to our top story, the comprehensive defeat of the New South Wales Labor government and the victory of Barry O'Farrell and his coalition. We're joined in the studio by former New South Wales Cabinet Minister Frank Sartor, who retired at Saturday's election. In 2009, he stood against Christina Keneally for the Labor leadership. Frank Sartor, welcome to Lateline.
Thank you very much.
You, of course, were a senior minister in the Labor government for a good 5 years before you went to the backbencher. How does a state Labor government get to the point that we get the bloodbath that we got on Saturday?
I think a number of things happen over time that build up and people don't see them. I think people became a bit addicted to success. They became addicted to what you might call cosmetic politics, the marketing side of politics, about being being political tacticians. And you forget the fact that, in fact, the fundamentals of good government are about good policy, good implementation, about making sure that we actually address things that we think long-term, not just short-term. And I think you fall into that sort of trap. At the same time, I think some sub-factions emerged. You saw people over time, over a decade or two, build up support in the caucus for themselves. A few new warlords set up their own shop, so to speak. It was a lolly shop, and people queued up for the lollies. And there was a famous saying at the caucus meeting in a statement by Joe Tripodi, in fact, in September 2009, the day that the new Reece cabinet was being chosen. And I had been dropped from the cabinet by Reece on Tripodi no bid say so. And Joe Tripodi got up and said, look, I need to explain to everyone, this is not a meritocracy. This is about politics. In other words, we don't appoint people on merit. Because if you weren't in the queue of the lolly shop, you didn't get into cabinet. So as a result, the quality of cabinet gradually got worse. If you look at the first Carr cabinet, it was actually much stronger than perhaps the last cabinet.
Well, I was going to ask you, when did the rot set in?
Well, I think some of the problems started to emerge actually in the late 90s, in the 90s.
Under Bob Carr?
Well, at the administrative side, not so much under Carr. Carr was a pretty astute leader and he had a strong cabinet. But the rot was setting in there, I think, when Roosendaal was General Secretary, the addiction to big donations from the business sector, donations that were obscenely large in some cases and taken at a time when government was dealing with their projects, was just stupid, totally stupid. So you had a situation where the sub-factions started to fill the party up with their mates, with the apparatchiks that supported them for no other reason than loyalty to them. And it wasn't just right and left, it was actually sub-factions in the right. And that became like a cancer in the right. I mean, Obeid is still there, he still hasn't gone. He should be resigning now, he should just go. But he's persisted. And that's how insidious it all became. And so once Carr left and his authority went with him, the cabinet became progressively weaker. I think Yema made a pretty good fist of it, but then we saw all this corrosion actually have an effect.
You talk about Eddie Obeid, of course, staying on the upper house for the midterm, but how much responsibility does that New South Wales right faction, do you think, bear? And in fact, is it less than some might say, given what you're talking about, faction within faction? I mean, how much responsibility do you sheet home to the likes of Eddie Obeid and Carl Bitar and Joe Tripodi?
Well, the administrative wing of the party, in my view, lost the plot after De La Bosca. I don't think that Roosendaal, Obeid and Bitar were anywhere near as good as their predecessors. I mean, they all wanted to be richer, they all wanted to be great fixers, but they weren't half as bright as Richo. Richo at least had brains. And so they allowed the party to be filled up with people in the backbench who weren't that good. The decision-making structures weren't very good. There wasn't collective decision-making. At the same time, this sort of bloc started to form in the right, which became very territorial. And once Carr left, once Carr was imminently about to leave, they sought to exert more power. Yema resisted that power. Yema tried to do a lot of good things. He was concerned about policy. He was trying to bring the party back to policy, but he failed because the administrative wing of the party decided he had to go. It's difficult to understand all their motivation, but it wasn't just electricity. Electricity was the pretext, but they were trying to get rid of Yema.
You're giving a commentary on a government almost as if it's over there and you're over here, but of course you were an integral part of this government. No. And as I say, well, you were a senior minister for 5 years. How did you cope with it? Planning minister, for example.
It was very frustrating, but I was not part of the kitchen cabinet. I was not part of the inner core. I was never on the budget committee. I was a senior minister, but I didn't see a lot of decisions at close range, except the ones that came to General Cabinet. I mean, to give you one example, the recent electricity privatisation model, the one pushed by Roosendaal and supported by Premier Keneally, never came to the full cabinet. It should have come to the full cabinet. It was a dopey model. It was never going to work.
So why not call time? Why not stand up? I mean, so many others in the Labor Party are more than capable of expressing your opinions. Why not? Well,
the fact is I wasn't an energy minister. I was the Treasurer. I raised it with the Premier twice. I said to her, look, you should talk to me about this. She said she would. It never happened. You know, it just was never put on the agenda. I mean, at the end of the day, we got very top-down, very centralised. Premiers and Treasurers, it's that team that runs government. Carr was fortunate. He had a brilliant Treasurer in Egan who was sound, who would stand up and tell Carr what he wouldn't want to hear. And then Yemma had a competent Treasurer, although he was very bombastic and probably caused more problems than he should have. And it went downhill from there. And so you ended up having a decline in the central decision-making apparatus, and others were not that involved. And at the same time, the party machine became too narrow. I mean, we lost the trust of the people.
I was going to say, Maurice Yemma says that the party machine declared war on the government. At the same time, Senator Mark Arbib, he told 7:30 tonight that the influence of the machine has been overstated in terms of policy.
That's completely untrue. That's completely untrue. The machine had determined that Yemma had to go even before electricity was near the final sort of conference that debated it.
Because that's Mark Arbib's argument, is it goes to state conference. That's where policy is decided by party members.
No, but party officials, one of them even told me that they had decided Yemma had to go, that electricity had nothing to do with it. So there was a move on Yemma. Electricity was a convenient way of trying to get rid of Yemma. The party officials decided they wanted to get rid of Yemma. It was an appallingly stupid thing to do, to try and cut down an elected Premier. And they got rid of him all right. Electricity failed, even though there were a couple of compromises that had been agreed to. And so once Yemma left and Reece was imposed on us at about 30 seconds notice, there was no debate, no deferral for a day for discussion. Then immediately the toxicity that came from that meant that Reece was being undermined. I don't think it was the right choice anyway, but the fact is that they just flowed on. It flowed on.
And of course, you against Christina Keneally, and if 2 more votes had gone your way, you would have been Premier. Could you have led to any different outcome than what happened Saturday, or had the rot set in by that point?
But at least when Keneally got elected, we had a ballot. When Reece got elected, there was no ballot. In fact, I got up in the right-wing caucus and said, let's defer this and discuss it. They all got up. The factional warlord and De La Bosco got up and said, no, we need to deal with it right now. There was no opportunity for discussion. There was no contest, no ballot. At least with Keneally, we had a ballot, and the caucus felt at least that they had a say. This notion, I mean, even Robbo now, I mean, Robbo's a bright, tough kind of character, but already he's been preordained.
Well, yes, John Robertson. Well, is that just now a fait accompli?
It should be the Catholic Church that preordains people, not the Labor Party. He's been ordained, the fix is on, and Robbo has to explain the role he played in destroying Yemma. So
who's backing John Robertson? What party machine is at work now? It's the party machine and the unions and the party machine. There is a dormant block of unions that control half the administrative committee, pretty much, and they only represent 10% of the workforce. So the fact that people say that because Eddie Obeid and Joe Tripodi and Carl Batar are no longer there, New South Wales right, the influence has pretty much been smashed. You would say no. You'd say party machine is still heavily at work.
No, party machine is still heavily at work. You've got the block that operates the admin committee. It's not an old admin committee in Richo's day. We had a lot of luminaries, a lot of debate, a lot of heavy hitters that all disagreed with each other. It was more of a collective then. It's actually run by a general secretary, and the unions tend to be dormant except when their own interests are at stake, and their own interests are really public sector workers. So the public sector workers in the state are on clover. They're paid a lot better than every other state, even if you take into account cost of living.
So is John Robertson the right person?
Well, look,
despite what you've just said?
Look, John Robertson, I think it's difficult, and I don't particularly want to choose one amongst the 3 or 4 contenders, but I have to say this. The fact that the fix has been on and he's been ordained months ago, I think is a really bad sign. And secondly, he has to play his role in tearing down Maurice Yemma.
And as well,
issues have to be addressed.
You've got a former Prime Minister, Paul Keating, and he wrote to Robertson saying, if the Labor Party stocks ever go so low as to require your services, that's parliamentary leadership, it will have no future itself. That's pretty damning, isn't it?
Well, it's very, very damning, and Paul, of course, is not known for understatement. It's also fair to say that, I mean, I personally think that the next Labor Premier is not in the Parliament at the moment. I think the Labor Party's got a lot of soul-searching to do. It does need to do some restructuring. It needs to understand that good policy is important. Cosmetic politics, focus groups, marketing is relevant sometimes, but is not the core issue. We need to go back to our values and actually develop good policies because our base has shrunk. The Liberal Party's base is broader than ours now.
But that comment about needing to go back to the values and needing to give the membership more value, that's been made many times over many years. Senator John Faulkner, a senior federal senator, said tonight, if we start from today with absolute commitment to putting the Labor interest above the factional interest, that'll be a massive step forward. And for the Labor Party, it'll be something we haven't seen in literally decades. Given you haven't seen that in literally decades, what hope is there for reforming? You're talking about fundamental party reform, stripping away all the layers.
Well, it will be difficult, and I hope they don't sit back and do little and hope that the tide turns again, because the tide will turn. But the simple fact is we have no choice but to make significant changes. We have to go back to developing good policy. We have to think about looking after the whole community, not just a few members of a few public sector unions.
But where's that going to come from? Is it going to be federal intervention? Because where's the drive for this change?
It'll come from the people. The simple fact is our base is eroded from both ends. It'll come from the people, and the simple fact is that whoever's leader eventually has to get it through their head, and the party apparatus have to get it through their heads, that we have to be better at reform, better at policy, like many Labor governments in the past have been. We've led the Liberal Party, we've led the nation in reform throughout the century.
Do you think there should be federal intervention now?
Well, I don't know what federal intervention will do. It's run by the likes of Bitara and Ib. I mean, I don't think that they know what they're doing necessarily. I think that we in New South Wales, and there's a lot of smart, good people in the Labor Party, it's a good organisation fundamentally, just have to take stock of this and say, look, we just don't want the same old fixes. I mean, even the Robertson thing, it should have been a much more open ballot. I mean, all these fixes that keep going on, stop the fixes, give people some democracy.
This raises the question, of course, of federal impact. Is the federal government right when they say that not too much can be read into this? I mean, what are the federal
Well, look, there's two good things for the federal government. The first good thing is that no longer do we have the distraction of New South Wales. I mean, they created it a bit because Rudd kept putting us down, but we no longer have the distraction of New South Wales, and it developed a mythology of its own that we were meant to be bad at everything, when in fact a lot of our services were actually very good. The second thing is that that now that more than half the population are governed by Liberal state governments, this whole idea that you can blame Labor governments across the nation is starting to dissipate. So Abbott's blame game is going to diminish. However, there are some significant problems for the Federal Liberal Party, and one is that they too have caught some of the disease where they think it's all about rapid-fire media cycle policy making on the run, and we've seen a few signs of that. They've really got to sharpen up and get much better at good policy. I mean, people like Combay are very good, but they've got a lot of catch-up to do to make sure they become a solid, stable government, delivering policies and thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead.
Where do you see the most similarities in federal Labor to the disaster of state Labor?
Well, our stupidity with the solar bonus scheme, where we followed the Greens. The Greens are the Pied Pipers of Australian politics. You follow them and you'll end up over a cliff.
And that applies to Julia Gillard?
Well, that's where they've got to be careful about. They haven't done it yet. But we followed them on the solar bonus scheme. We blew $2.3 billion of public money in New South Wales because the Greens had a policy, and Robertson and Rees followed them. Gillard has to be very careful. We need to be a Green party, we need to be an environmentally strong party, but we need to do it on our own terms. A bit like the Hawke-Keating government was, a bit like the McKell government was, a bit like the Rand government was, and a bit like the early days of the Carr government. We were green and we were strong on our terms. We were sensible green, sustainable, not mad green, like a third of the Green Party are quite mad, as we know, very left-wing and very mad. And they have to be very careful to pursue strong environmental issues, but on their terms, not on the terms of Bob Brown and the Greens, because the Greens are an extremist party. They're an absolutist party.
Well,
and that's one of the real dangers for Gillard.
They would disagree with you wholeheartedly, but in the federal sphere, I guess...
I'm happy to debate with the Greens anyway.
In the federal sphere, though, I guess the question becomes whether or not that same New South Wales right influence is really apparent. Yes, there are a number of ministers who have that power base, but most federal Labor will tell you that there haven't been factions federally for a long time.
Probably true, but the methodology has been similar. This notion of political, basically tactical politics and focus groups has been strong there too, rather than solid policy development and start with good policy. Good politics follows good policy. I think Keating said that, a number of federal people have said that. And I think that's where the shown signs have been quite wobbly. They may correct that, but they have to get much steadier, and they have to be careful not to be drawn into the abyss of the extremes on both their flanks.
So if John Robertson, as seems likely, is going to be elected later this week as the leader of Labor, you'd say he's just an interim leader? He'll just be running with a poison chalice for...
I hope he surprises me, and I hope he surprises all of us, but he does represent a fairly narrow base. the old industrial base, which still runs and dominates the Labor Party, is a little bit irrelevant. We have to become a broader social democratic church. And John, I don't think, at the end of the day, will pull in a majority of the votes in New South Wales. Now, he may, and I hope he does. And I personally get on with him. He won't like what I've got to say tonight. But the fact is, I don't think the future Premier is in the Parliament.
A final question. How much responsibility do you bear, personally? You were a member of this government, well, whether you had the power or not.
Look, that's a good question. That's one that I agonise about many times. I had many ethical dilemmas about whether to resign or leave or whatever, but you take the view that you're part of a team and you're there for the long haul. There were times when I was planning minister and party officials were collecting obscene donations, and I later discovered it, and it was making my job impossible.
But you didn't speak up.
Well, I did internally. I refused to go to some fundraisers. I did a lot of things internally. People never saw that. I mean, what got rid of me as planning minister were the developers. They were angry because they weren't obviously getting what they thought in their heads they were going to get. The developers were my real enemies. People out there thought it was the local community members. It was actually the developers. Perhaps in retrospect, I should have left the portfolio at the 07 election, but I actually wanted to keep it because I thought that I probably I was better at being a better gatekeeper than some others might have been. Now, should I have left? What else could I have done? I mean, all I could have really done was walked out. You would have got, you know, the party's not very forgiving as far as public dissent goes, especially if you're a cabinet minister.
Well, it certainly has to be said, a lot of members did in fact walk out, didn't they, just prior to this election, but it's going to be many long, hard yards for the Labor Party in New South Wales. Frank Sartor, many thanks for talking to Lateline.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.